You found it tucked away behind the bottom shelf of that old walnut bookcase, the one nobody touched anymore, hidden behind brittle atlases and faded encyclopedias, wrapped in a thick, scratchy cloth that smelled of dry paper, rusted hinges, and time itself. And when you picked it up, your fingers brushed against a cover that had no title, no date, no claim of authorship, only two faded initials. KZ, as if whoever had written it never wanted to be found, or maybe wanted to be remembered without being seen. I watched you hold it gently, almost reverently, as if even before opening it, you knew that what lay inside wasn't just words, but something far older, deeper, heavier. And when you opened the first page, when your eyes began scanning that crooked handwriting, I saw your expression shift, your breath catch, and your hands tremble ever so slightly, as though the past had reached out and touched you. A do before you had time to brace for it. And then you looked at me, not the way you look at an old man who lives in a quiet house with ticking clocks and worn slippers, but as if for a moment you were seeing someone you had always known but never really met. And maybe you were, because the truth is, I am the one who wrote it. I am the man behind that hidden diary. And for more years than I care to admit, I kept it locked away, not just in that drawer, but in myself, behind a silence that I wore like a uniform, behind stories I never told and memories I never shared, because I convinced myself they were too painful, too personal, or perhaps too small to matter in a world that no longer remembered what it meant to lose something you never truly had. I didn't write it to be read, not really. I wrote because I had to. Because there were days when the only thing keeping me alive was the shape of her name in my mind, the echo of her voice in the space between sentences, and the quiet prayer that maybe, somehow, my words would reach across the ocean, through the fog of war, through time itself, and touch her again, or at least keep her alive inside me, even when everything else was falling apart. You must be wondering why I never told anyone, not your father, not your grandmother, not even myself, not out loud. And maybe it was fear, or pride, or just the weight of knowing that once a truth is spoken, it can't be taken back. And maybe I wasn't ready to live with what those truths might do to the life I had built in their absence. But now, because you found it, because you saw me in those pages before I could admit who I once was, I know it's time. Time to speak, time to remember, time to be seen, and maybe, finally, to be understood. If this story is touching you the way it touched me while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, prepare yourself, because what comes next will change everything. It began in the winter of 1943, on a night so bitter that even the light bulbs in the barracks flickered as if they too were trying to keep warm. I was stationed at Camp Kosciuszko, just outside Chicago, one of several temporary facilities where displaced Polish soldiers, volunteers, and immigrants like me had gathered after the invasion of our homeland, all of us suspended between grief and duty, between the language of home and the orders of war. And it was there on a borrowed bunk with nothing but a blanket too thin and silence too loud that I first picked up a pen and began to write, not because I thought anyone would ever read it, but because if I didn't put something down on paper, I truly believed I would disappear into the noise of history. The notebook was standard issue, nothing special. A plain, khaki-bound journal, handed out with ration slips and military forms, the kind of thing you were expected to use for inventory or duty logs. But instead, I filled it with everything I wasn't supposed to say. Fear, longing, anger, sorrow, and most of all, love. That quiet, pulsing love that had nowhere to go and yet refused to be buried beneath layers of discipline and survival. At first, the entries were fragmented, half-formed, more emotion than language, just words scrawled in haste after drills, after cold meals in the mess hall, after news from Europe that made the men next to me light cigarettes with shaking hands. But very quickly those words began to take shape, and they always led me back to her, to Maria, the girl from Milwaukee, with fingers that moved like Music and a laugh that made even the brick walls of the church basement we met in feel warmer, less temporary, more like home. We'd met the year before at a community fundraiser held by the Polish Catholic parish on the south side. Just weeks before I shipped out, she was helping fold linens and serve soup to new arrivals from the East Coast, and I was trying to hide the nerves in my stomach beneath a pressed uniform and polite small talk. But when I saw her hands brushing flour from her apron and heard the way she say, my name soft but certain, something inside me shifted, as if I had been waiting to hear that voice all my life without knowing it. In the weeks that followed, we wrote letters back and forth, brief but intimate, folded and passed in secret behind the community hall. She worked as a seamstress for a German-American family who still spoke Polish in whispers, and I knew even then that our moments together were numbered, marked by the same countdown I felt every time I checked the wall calendar beside my cot. When I left, she gave me a handkerchief embroidered with her initial and the words, "Return to me," stitched in thread so fine it looked like hair. I kept it close, folded and pressed into my uniform above my heart, a vow more sacred than anything I'd been sworn to in uniform. So I wrote, every night. Through blizzards and mosquito summers, through basic training and medical checks, through news reports of bombings and betrayals, I wrote, sometimes to her, sometimes to God, and sometimes just to the version of myself I hoped would survive all this. And the diary grew, not in pages alone, but in weight, emotional weight, as though every sentence I added made it harder to close, harder to hide, harder to carry. But I carried it anyway. Through mud fields and chow lines, through Polish gatherings in Chicago basements where old men sang patriotic songs with wet eyes and cracked voices. And I never once let it leave my possession, because it was the only thing that felt like mine. The entries became more structured, more vivid. I described not only what I saw and felt, but also what I dreamed for the future. A little house near the lake, wooden siding, painted blue, with a porch swing where Maria would sit on warm evenings sewing clothes for neighbors, while I read the paper beside her. And maybe children would be chasing fireflies in the yard or arguing over who got the last slice of cherry pie. I gave them names, these imaginary children, just to hear how they'd sound. Anna and Peter, quiet and key. Lever with her eyes and my stubbornness. And I wrote about holidays we'd never spend together, Christmases filled with cedar branches and midnight masses, Easters with white borscht and laughter. But beyond the dreams, there was always the reality, the fear that I would never find her again, the guilt that I had not done more to protect her, even if there was nothing I could have done. And that fear crystallized in the spring of 1945, when a friend returned from a trip to Milwaukee and told me the Polish district had been hit hard by a warehouse fire, a stray bomb. No one could say exactly what had happened, but a row of buildings near her family's address had collapsed, and there had been casualties, and no, he didn't know the names. But something in his voice told me that if I hadn't already lost her, I was about to. That night, I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I sat in the barracks long after lights out, hunched over the journal, holding the pen she had given me, and I wrote a single line, one that I thought might be the last I'd ever write in that book. If you're still breathing, forgive me for not coming back in time. I closed the journal, wrapped it in the cloth she had sewn, and placed it in the bottom of my duffel. Not because I was finished, but because something in me had broken, and I didn't know how to keep writing when the words could no longer reach her. It's strange how something so small, a handkerchief, embroidered with a single letter folded once, then again, and slipped quietly into a coat pocket, can carry so much weight, can hold more memory than a photograph, more hope than a spoken promise, more heartbreak than a goodbye ever could. And even now, all these years later, I can still feel its texture against my chest, the way it pressed, gently through the lining of my uniform with every step, every drill, every march away from the life I had imagined and toward something I couldn't yet name. That handkerchief and the kiss she left in my palm that night were the only real things I had of her after she left, after she was hurried away with her parents to a farmhouse near Green Bay, fleeing rumors of raids, of arrests, of people disappearing. And I remember how quickly everything happened, how her voice trembled not with fear, but with urgency, like someone trying to leave a message on a stormy radio signal before the static swallowed it up forever. She pressed the cloth into my hand, her fingers lingering only for a second, and whispered, "Promise me you'll come back." And before I could answer, she was gone, turning the corner beneath a flickering street lamp, like the final scene in a film reel that had run out of frames. That night, I didn't go back to the barracks. I walked the length of Milwaukee Avenue 3 times, retracing my steps, hoping to see her one more time, even if only as a silhouette behind a curtain. But all I found was the wind, the dark, and my own reflection in a butcher shop window, a boy in a soldier's coat who had just realized how much there was to lose. From that night on, the diary became our house, a house we never lived in. A house I built in my mind, page by page, room by room, a porch with creaky steps she'd complain about every spring, a kitchen window overlooking Lake Michigan where she'd bake poppy seed rolls with her sleeves rolled up, a tiny bedroom with pale curtains and a radio that played Polish waltzes late into the night. I described everything. The smell of her hair in October, the way she tapped her foot when she was nervous, the names of our future children, Anna, because she once told me it meant grace, and Michael, after my grandfather, because I wanted to believe he'd protect us from wherever he was. I wrote about mornings filled with church bells and the scent of fried onions from the neighbor's kitchen, about Sunday walks to Humboldt Park, where we'd feed ducks and argue about what kind of dog we'd adopt. I wrote these things not to escape the war, but to survive it, because even though the gunfire and distance made it impossible to find her, writing made it feel as if she hadn't truly left. You do, but there were cracks in the fantasy, tremors of reality I couldn't avoid. Rumors from other soldiers, letters from back home filled with crossed-out lines and bad news scribbled in the margins. And every time I heard Milwaukee mentioned in a conversation, my body would freeze, my heart holding its breath, waiting to hear her name spoken. But it never came, until it did. In April 1945, word came through a fellow serviceman whose cousin worked in fire recovery in Wisconsin. He spoke casually, unaware of what he was saying, about a tenement fire caused by faulty wiring, about several Polish families affected, about a woman whose name sounded vaguely familiar, who had lived near a bakery on Lincoln Avenue, whose building had collapsed while they were still inside. He didn't know more than that, but I did. I knew. And when he left, I went to the barracks, opened the diary, and sat there with the pen in my hand, the one she had given me, the ink already drying, and I tried to write, tried to form words that could hold the shape of what I had just lost. But there were no sentences, no stories, no metaphors left, only the truth, brutal and quiet and final. So I wrote one line. "If you're still breathing, forgive me for not coming back in time." That was the end of our house. The walls I had built with such care collapsed in a single breath. The kitchen went dark, the radio stopped playing, and the children I had named vanished like chalk drawings in the rain. I closed the diary and pressed it to my chest, the way I had pressed her handkerchief so many times before, and I cried in a way I never had before, not with sobs or sounds, but with stillness, the kind of stillness that takes hours to notice and years to undo. I didn't write again for a long time, not because I didn't have more to say, but because everything I wrote still ended with her, and I was afraid that putting anything else down would mean leaving her behind, and I wasn't ready, not then, not for many years, and maybe truthfully not ever. Coming back to America after the war wasn't a victory march or a triumphant return to open arms. It was quieter than that, lonelier than anyone ever talks about. It was the kind of homecoming where the train doors open and no one is there to greet you, where the streets feel familiar in shape but not in spirit, where the language is yours, but the rhythm of life has shifted so completely that Evie, in simple things, A cup of coffee, a mailbox, a child's laughter feel foreign, like echoes from a life you used to live, but no longer belong to. I settled in Buffalo, not because it meant anything to me then, but because it had work, a modest Polish-American community, and cold winters that matched the ones I grew up with. And for a while that was enough. I delivered mail for a few years, trudging through snowdrifts in wool coats that never dried, handing out letters filled with joy or sorrow or bills. And every time I dropped a handwritten envelope into someone's hand, I wondered what it would be like if someone ever received mine. The ones I never sent, the ones buried under floorboards, the ones that said too much and not enough all at once. Eventually I stopped wondering and found a job as a watch repairman, not because I knew how, but because someone needed help in the back of a shop, and I was good with silence. And in that silence, with the tick of second hands and the hum of radio static in the background, I learned to fix things, broken gears, cracked faces, fractured time. And it gave me something steady, something routine, and something safe. People came to know me as dependable, polite, quiet, Mr. Kowalski, the man with the steady hands, the sad smile. And no one asked why. I never spoke much about the old days, and I never offered, because I had become fluent in the kind of silence that passes for stability, the kind that people respect, even admire, without realizing it's built not on peace, but on the careful arrangement of ghosts. And then there was Margaret. She came into the shop one afternoon with a broken kitchen timer and a warmth in her voice that didn't try to fix me, didn't ask too much. She was a widow too, her husband lost in the Pacific, and we understood each other in a way that didn't require backstory. She made pot roast on Sundays, tended a tiny backyard garden with more faith than I had in God, and when she touched my arm, it felt like forgiveness I hadn't earned. We married quietly, no ceremony, just a courthouse and a borrowed suit, and we built a life together, not grand or loud or full of declarations, but steady and warm. And I loved her. I did, in the way a man can love with what he has left, which sometimes isn't everything, but enough to show up, to stay, to listen, to grow old side by side. We had children, 2 sons, and later grandchildren, and they knew me as Dad, as Grandpa, as the man who whittled toys from scrapwood and always had peppermint in his pocket. But they never knew the full story, never asked why I had a box in the back of the closet I never opened, why I never played music from my youth, why I always paused when someone said the name Maria, even if it belonged to a neighbor's niece or a movie actress. The diary remained where I had hidden it years before, wrapped in the cloth she had once touched, tucked into a box beneath the floorboards of our bedroom. Alongside the pen she had given me, her photograph, faded but still impossibly vivid, and a letter I started but never finished, a letter that began with "My dearest," and ended abruptly in a sentence I could never complete. I lived my days by the rhythm of clocks, their winding, their ticks, their predictable, merciful repetition. And though the world moved on around me, and our sons grew tall, and the house aged, and our hair grayed, I remained quietly tethered to 1945, to that spring afternoon when I wrote that final line in the diary and couldn't find the next one. Margaret never asked about the past. Perhaps because she had her own ghosts, or perhaps because she sensed that mine were too fragile to touch. But in the way she placed a blanket over my shoulders on cold nights, or how she set 2 teacups even when I said I wasn't thirsty, I think she knew there was someone else who still lived in the quiet corners of my heart. And I carried that silence like a duty, not out of shame, but out of reverence, out of fear that to speak would unravel the fragile balance we had built, would betray the life we had created, or worse, would make it feel like it wasn't enough. And so, I let the years pile up like snow on the porch steps, soft and slow, until I could no longer remember what it was like to say her name out loud, without feeling like I was stealing something. When Margaret passed, gently in her sleep, one January morning so quiet the furnace sounded like a church bell, the house felt colder than it ever had, even in its earliest days, And for the first time in decades, I went into the closet, pulled out the box, and held the diary in my hands again. It felt heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I was just older. I sat in the bedroom and opened the pages. And for hours I read through a younger man's handwriting, the shaky lines, the run-on sentences, the longing packed into every syllable. And I wept, not from grief, but from recognition. Because after all these years, those words still held the only version of myself I had never shared, the only truth I had refused to speak. But I still wasn't ready to let anyone else see. Not yet. Not until... It didn't begin with a dramatic moment or any great ceremony, no storms rolling in over the lake, no thunderclaps of destiny. It began instead with something so small and ordinary, it might have gone unnoticed entirely, if not for the way time moves when you're near the end of it. You were visiting for the weekend, just like you always did, dropping your overnight bag on the same Chen chair, asking if I still kept butterscotch candies in the old jar near the phone, smiling that way you always smiled when you weren't sure if I was glad to see you. And maybe I didn't always show it, but I was every time, because by then I had started to understand that presence, real presence, was a gift not everyone is lucky enough to receive, especially from someone young enough to be anywhere else. It was late in the afternoon, and we had just finished organizing some of Margaret's old quilting things. You were patient with the fabrics, careful with the threads, and I remember thinking how strange it was that your hands, so young and steady, seemed to hold the same reverence for memory that I had only learned to carry after half a lifetime of forgetting. You noticed the dresser in the Gue, a Saint Room, the heavy one that had stood there untouched since the day we bought it, the one I always walked past without looking too long, as if afraid it might look back, and without asking you moved toward it, as naturally as though something was calling you to it. I should have stopped you. I should have said, not that one, or leave that alone, or some other quiet defense that would have maintained the order of things, would have kept the silence safe a little while longer. But instead, I said nothing. I just stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame, watching your hands explore the old drawers, pulling out scrapbooks and photo sleeves, and then, finally, reaching toward the bottom panel, the one I had loosened decades ago, so I could slide that linen-wrapped box beneath it and pretend it didn't exist. You found it. You turned toward me with a question in your eyes, not spoken but heard all the same, and I didn't nod, didn't flinch, didn't move at all. I simply held your gaze, and in that suspended breath between past and present, something shifted. Not in the room, not in the house, but in me, because I knew the moment had come. You unwrapped the cloth slowly, like someone opening a gift from a different century, and when you saw the diary, that small, worn, brown-bound book with the gold-pressed initials on the front, KZ, almost faded into invisibility. You didn't say anything. Instead, you sat down in the old armchair by the window, opened the book to a random page, and began to read. And I stood there, silent, still, listening not to your voice, because you read in silence, but to something deeper, older, as though I could hear my younger self speaking through you, my memories finding their way out of exile, one paragraph at a time. And in your face, I saw something I had never allowed myself to hope for, understanding, not pity, not judgment, not curiosity for its own sake, but recognition. As if somehow you already knew that love could survive silence, that grief could stretch across generations like an invisible bridge. And when you finally looked up, your eyes wet, your voice soft, you said, "Grandpa, I think I know what this is. I think I felt this too." It was then that I sat beside you, and for the first time in my entire life, I spoke those words out loud. It was me. I was the one who wrote it. What followed wasn't a flood. It was a slow release, like spring thaw, like ice that had spent too many years pretending to be stone, now melting under the warmth of someone simply willing to listen. I told you everything, or as much as I could before the emotions made my throat too thick to speak. about Maria and the parish where we met, about the last kiss she left in my hand like a seed I never got to plant, about the house we never built but that I had described in such detail it still lives in my mind, about the letter I never sent and the line I wrote when I believed I'd lost her forever. You didn't interrupt. You didn't try to explain anything away or say that it had all worked out in the end. You simply listened, like you were carrying it with me, not trying to fix it, just holding it steady. And in that moment, something I had believed would remain broken inside me forever began to shift, not toward healing exactly, but toward peace. You told me, and I will never forget the way your voice trembled when you said it, that this diary wasn't just mine anymore, that it had become a story for anyone who had ever loved quietly, who had ever mourned what could have been, who had ever returned from war and struggled to return to themselves. You said the words I could never have written on my own. This isn't about the past, Grandpa. This is about all of us. This is how we remember, and so I gave it to you, not because I was done with it, not because I no longer needed it, but because it was finally ready to be shared, not as a confession, not as a eulogy, but as a bridge between everything I had kept inside and everything you were willing to carry forward. And in that handing over, a quiet, unceremonious, sacred, I became, for the first time in decades, something I had long given up on being, seen. The diary is no longer mine, not in the way it once was, not as a secret folded between silence and longing, not as a burden I carried quietly through decades of winter mornings and sleepless nights. Now it sits in your hands on your shelf, maybe beside the family photographs or the books you reread when the world feels too loud, and I watch you read it, not as a young man trying to understand, be an old one, but as someone listening across generations, not for answers, but for something more important, truth. I don't need you to see me as a hero. I never was. I was a man who loved and lost and loved again, who built a life on shaky foundations, who stayed silent not because he was strong, but because the words were heavier than anyone could have guessed. And even now, after telling you everything, after opening the wound I once thought had long since scarred over, I find myself afraid, not of being judged, but of being misunderstood, of someone reading those pages and seeing only war, only tragedy, and not the quiet, persistent heartbeat of love that kept me writing when the world kept falling apart. This story, mine, yours, ours, is not about the war, not really. It's about what the war could never touch. The pieces of ourselves we kept hidden, the promises we whispered to empty rooms, the prayers we folded into pillowcases and uniforms and unfinished letters, hoping that someday, somehow, someone would find them and understand what we were too afraid to say out loud. I lived a full life, yes, a good one by most accounts. I loved a woman who stood by me even when I couldn't give her all of myself. I raised children who became better men than I ever was. I worked with my hands and made clocks tick again. I watched summers come and go through the same kitchen window. I grew old with dignity and grace. But a part of me always remained in that final letter, in that unfinished sentence, in that one line scrawled on a cold night in 1945, asking for forgiveness I never knew how to seek. And now, because of you, that sentence is no longer the last word. Because of you, the story breathes again. Because of you, the silence that followed my love for Maria has found a voice. Not to rewrite history, not to resurrect what was lost, but to remind those still here that memory is not just a burden, it's a bridge. And when we share what we've hidden, even the deepest grief becomes something more than sorrow. It becomes connection. Thank you for listening. Thank you for not turning away. Thank you for holding my words like something worth keeping. I was the man behind the hidden diary, but now, with my heart finally open, I am simply someone who was lucky enough to be heard before it was too late. We share new stories every day, real voices that stir, heal, and inspire. If this one touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more heartfelt stories like this one.